The quiet village of Westbridge was a place where the bustling of daily life was tucked away beneath a blanket of peace. It was the kind of place where you could find yourself lost in thought without a care for the world. At least, that was the illusion. Beneath the peaceful facades, where people sipped their afternoon teas and exchanged pleasantries, tensions had a way of simmering just below the surface. It was the annual summer garden party at Lady Harrow's sprawling estate, a gathering that the villagers eagerly anticipated each year. The weather, just warm enough to coax the last blooms from the rose bushes, set the scene for an afternoon that was to remain, as always, civil and genteel. The news arrived like a swift gust of wind, and with it the delicate calm that had enveloped Lady Harrow's garden party vanished in an instant. The scene had seemed so idyllic moments before, the guests laughing, the servants darting in and out with fresh trays of finger sandwiches and tea. But now the murmurs began. "Someone's gone missing," whispered Mrs. Pemberton, a hand fluttering to her chest. She was a woman who had lived in Westbridge for nearly 3 decades, yet Miss Marple had always thought of her as an outsider. It wasn't that Mrs. Pemberton wasn't welcome, far from it, but there was always a sense of unease about her. She spoke little and observed much like Miss Marple herself. Missing? Miss Harrow's voice was a little too loud, as though she was trying to regain control of the conversation. "Who's missing?" "Henry Collins," said Mrs. Pemberton, voice shaking ever so slightly. "He's not been seen for nearly half an hour." A ripple of unease spread through the gathered crowd. Henry Collins, well-liked, seemingly steady, was a quiet man who kept to himself, but his sudden disappearance at such a time made the air thick with suspicion. Had he fallen ill, gone for a walk to clear his head, or something darker? Miss Marple took a few measured steps to the side, allowing the group to murmur on. "Perhaps he just stepped away for a moment," Miss Harrow offered. Her attempt at reassurance was clearly not believed by everyone. "He does tend to wander off now and then." But Miss Marple's keen eyes, trained over years of watching people, could tell something more was at play. The way Lady Harrow's smile tightened, the way she glanced quickly at her housekeeper who stood nearby. There was an oddness to the whole affair, something unsettling in its quiet certainty. Within minutes, the party was broken. Guests began moving in scattered groups, their voices falling into low tones. Miss Marple watched as some hurried toward the estate's back gardens, where Henry Collins was last seen. Others, like Mrs. Banks, were busy making excuses to leave, though no one had yet stated that the gathering was officially over. The garden, once a haven of laughter and light conversation, now felt heavy with anxiety. Miss Marple stood back, her hands folded in front of her as she observed. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Inspector Thompson, a stout man with a thick greying moustache and a tendency to bark orders at his subordinates, appeared at the front gate, flanked by a couple of constables. The villagers quickly gathered around, each eager to offer some form of speculation, no matter how far-fetched. "Where did you last see him?" Inspector Thompson demanded of Lady Harrow. She hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I'm not sure. He was speaking to Mrs. Collins by the rose garden, but after that I didn't notice him." "Typical," Mrs. Pemberton muttered under her breath, though her tone lacked conviction. "Always wandering off. Never seems to understand his own limits." "You don't understand, Mrs. Pemberton," Lady Harrow snapped, though her voice was far from certain. "Henry is a good man. He would never just disappear." But Miss Marple, standing off to the side, took a step closer to the two women, listening carefully. There was something about Lady Harrow's tone, something rushed, almost desperate. Something didn't fit. Henry Collins was a quiet, reclusive man, yes, but he was not known for doing anything so erratic as vanishing into thin air without reason. As the police scoured the estate's grounds, the villagers grew increasingly uneasy. The news of Henry's disappearance spread like wildfire through the village. The usual routine was shattered. The silence that followed seemed unnatural, and Miss Marple, with her years of experience, could sense the building tension. The uncertainty gnawed at the edges of their conversations, making it clear that none of them were quite as calm as they appeared. Behind every smile and nod was a shadow, a fear that perhaps their quiet village was not as safe as it once had been. By late evening, the searchers had found him. It wasn't long before the word reached the gathering. It was Mrs. Collins, Henry's wife, who appeared first at the door, as pale as a ghost. She spoke quickly, her voice barely audible. "Come," she said, gesturing with a trembling hand. "He's in the shed, the garden shed." The guests, who had been lingering on the outskirts, exchanged looks of shock, confusion, and fear. Miss Marple, however, felt no surprise. She was already beginning to piece things together. "Henry," Mrs. Collins whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around the crowd. He's dead." Miss Marple didn't need to be told. She already knew. The body was found behind the garden shed, just behind the tall hedge where the roses had been so carefully arranged. Henry Collins was lying there, sprawled awkwardly, as though he had fallen or collapsed, though Miss Marple could see the truth in the way he lay. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple collapse. No, something more sinister had occurred. The first responders, the police constables, seemed almost overwhelmed. They had never had to deal with a crime of this nature in the peaceful village of Westbridge. Murder, plain and simple, had struck the heart of their village, and it was not something any of them were prepared for. They stumbled over their words, speaking in hushed tones as they cordoned off the area. "His neck is broken," said one of the officers, a young constable with wide eyes. No sign of a struggle. It's as though he simply dropped. And that was when Miss Marple made her move. She walked towards the officers, her soft, unassuming presence slipping past them unnoticed. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she crouched by the body, studying it closely. Her sharp eyes caught the smallest details, a faint discoloration around the neck, a rip in the sleeve that hadn't been noticed before. "I should have known," Miss Marple murmured to herself, though no one could hear her. "It's always the quiet ones." She stood up and turned, her gaze flicking across the gathering crowd. She didn't need to ask questions. It was all there in their faces, the confusion, the fear, the rising suspicion. "Don't worry, everyone," she said, her voice calm, steady. "We will get to the bottom of this, you can be sure of that." And with that, Miss Marple slipped back into the crowd, quietly watching as the others continued to react. The mystery had begun, and Miss Marple was already several steps ahead of everyone else. As the guests mingled, enjoying their tea and conversation, Miss Marple stood to one side, her sharp eyes taking in the intricate dance of social interaction. She had known these people for years, and while they all played their parts well, she knew better than to trust appearances. Lady Harrow, ever the gracious hostess, beamed as she greeted the guests. Her laughter, light and lilting, seemed to permeate the air around her, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightness in the older woman's smile, a tension that only years of careful observation could reveal. Miss Marple's attention shifted to other figures, and she quickly noted a few other subtleties. The way Mr. Pemberton kept his hand tightly clenched around his teacup, the hurried way Mrs. Banks made her way to the corner, avoiding anyone's gaze. The party continued, the murmurs of polite conversation blending into a gentle hum. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the manicured lawn, something shifted in the air. A slight tension, unspoken yet palpable, filled the space between the villagers. Miss Marple could feel it, the shift, the tightening of something once held firmly together, now beginning to unravel. But there was no time to dwell on it just yet. The evening was too delicate, and people too eager to uphold their reputations to allow anything to break the facade. And yet, in the midst of this seemingly untroubled gathering, a body would soon be found. The following days in Westbridge were nothing like the serene tranquillity that the village had once known. News of Henry Collins' death had shaken the very foundation of the community. Though many had privately feared that something like this might happen one day, no one had truly expected it to come so soon, nor with such devastating suddenness. The constables had done their best to secure the scene of the crime, but there was little they could actually do to stem the growing tide of suspicion. Lady Harrow, in her usual unflappable manner, had attempted to maintain some semblance of order, hosting a small gathering the day after the discovery. The guests, most of them involved in one way or another in the lives of Henry Collins or his widow, exchanged strained pleasantries over afternoon tea. It was a typical social event in Westbridge, except this time the conversation lingered on nothing but the murder. Miss Marple, as ever, was an observer rather than a participant. She sat by the window in Lady Harrow's drawing room, a cup of tea resting in her hands. Outside, the village was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful silence it had been before. Instead, there was a sense of expectancy in the air, a subtle weight, as though something was about to break. She glanced over her shoulder at the assembled villagers, listening to the fragments of their conversations. The words were the same: tragic, mysterious, terrible misfortune. But Miss Marple wasn't fooled. These people, who had known Henry Collins for years, had secrets of their own. Everyone had their little things they preferred to keep hidden, and in moments like this, when tension was running high, those secrets had a tendency to surface in the most unexpected ways. Lady Harrow was speaking with Mrs. Pemberton, and Miss Marple caught the final sentence of the conversation. "I'm sure it's just an unfortunate accident," Lady Harrow was saying, her voice soothing, though Miss Marple detected an odd hesitation in her words. "Oh, I'm sure you're right," Mrs. Pemberton replied, though her tone lacked the same conviction. "I've heard the police are thinking of ruling it as such. No one would do something so—" She trailed off, her eyes darting nervously. It wasn't just the death that had unsettled Mrs. Pemberton, it was the very idea of a murderer among them. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Pemberton had always been someone who shied away from confrontation, even in the most benign of situations. Her nervous energy seemed heightened now, as though she were terrified of something more than just the death of Henry Collins. "Would you mind excusing me for a moment?" Miss Marple said gently, rising from her seat. She left the room before anyone could protest, her pace slow but deliberate as she moved through the hall and out into the garden. It was a warm afternoon, and she could hear the birds singing in the trees, the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. But for Miss Marple, this peaceful setting only served to highlight the disquiet that clung to everything. As she wandered toward the garden, shed where Henry Collins had been found, Miss Marple allowed herself to reflect. The official investigation, such as it was, had yet to yield any substantial results. The police had found no obvious signs of foul play beyond the broken neck. No footprints, no blood, no weapons. The crime scene was eerily clean, almost too clean, and that unsettled Miss Marple. A broken neck, they had said, and no signs of struggle. But there was something off about the whole situation. She arrived at the shed and stood for a moment, observing the place with a quiet intensity. The shed itself was humble, old, wooden, and unassuming. It seemed an unlikely place for a murder, yet that was precisely what made it so telling. Henry Collins had not been found in a place of comfort or familiarity, but in a secluded, almost abandoned part of the estate. Miss Marple glanced around, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The grass where Henry's body had fallen was still slightly flattened, though the traces of disturbance were almost gone now, thanks to the efforts of the constables. The shed door, slightly ajar when Henry had been found, was now securely closed. But Miss Marple noticed the faint scratch marks near the latch, a small detail that the police had missed. With her trained eye, Miss Marple knew immediately that these marks were too recent to be from the weather. They were fresh, almost deliberate, as though someone had attempted to force the door open in a hurry. She reached out, carefully pressing her fingertips to the wooden surface, and felt a faint warmth lingering in the air. It was at that moment that she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Mrs. Pemberton coming toward her, her hands clasped tightly together. The woman looked more unsettled than Miss Marple had ever seen her, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously to the ground. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice a little too soft. "No, not at all," Miss Marple replied, giving the woman a kind smile. "I was just admiring the shed. It's quite picturesque, isn't it?" Mrs. Pemberton didn't return the smile. Instead, she looked down at the ground, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Her discomfort was palpable, and Miss Marple, always perceptive, could sense that Mrs. Pemberton was hiding something. She wasn't sure what yet, but there was something about this woman, about her fidgeting and her reluctance to meet Miss Marple's gaze, that spoke volumes. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Pemberton began after a pause, her voice trembling slightly, "I do hope the police aren't looking at me too closely. I don't know anything about what happened to Henry. I barely knew him." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal her interest without revealing too much. "Did you know him, Mrs. Pemberton?" she asked quietly. "Or rather, did you know his wife?" The question hung in the air for a long moment, and Miss Marple could see the instant tension in Mrs. Pemberton's expression. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came out. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice calm. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her tone unhurried, "sometimes it's not what we say that matters, but what we don't. Mrs. Pemberton swallowed hard, her fingers tightening in her hands. "I don't know what you mean," she muttered, but the tremor in her voice gave her away. Miss Marple said nothing more. Instead, she turned back to the shed, her mind already working through the possibilities. The marks on the door, the unease in Mrs. Pemberton's voice. Something about this didn't add up. It was as though the pieces of a puzzle were scattered in front of her, waiting to be assembled. But for now, she would wait. She had learned long ago that the best mysteries were solved through patience and observation, not hasty conclusions. The days following Henry Collins' death were marked by an undercurrent of tension that could no longer be ignored. The police, still grasping at the most basic of leads, had begun to shift their focus toward the family and closest associates of the deceased. It wasn't long before the first obvious suspect emerged: George Collins, the younger brother of the deceased. George was a man whose presence seemed to invite suspicion. He had been a local figure of some repute, though his repute was built more on whispers than accolades. He had returned to Westbridge only recently, after years of living abroad, and his relationship with Henry had always been complicated. The two had never been particularly close, and their occasional public spats about money, family matters, and Henry's controlling nature had given rise to many rumours. When the police arrived at George's small cottage on the outskirts of the village to question him, he was an unlikely picture of calm. Despite the sombre news, he did not appear distressed. In fact, he seemed almost too composed. "I don't know what to tell you, Inspector," George said, his voice smooth but with a certain flatness. "I haven't seen Henry in a few weeks. He was always busy with his own things. I thought he might have just had a fall or something." The inspector, no stranger to the dynamics of family feuds, wasn't buying it. "But you were both supposed to meet that afternoon," he said, flipping through the papers in his hand. "You had arranged to discuss business matters. Is that not right?" George shifted uncomfortably, but the movement was subtle, a slight flicker in his gaze, the smallest of pauses before responding. "I'm sure we did, but I wasn't expecting him to drop by unannounced. Perhaps I didn't hear him arrive." A barely perceptible quiver passed through George's voice, something that the inspector immediately latched onto. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel the growing suspicion that George Collins knew more than he was letting on. Miss Marple, of course, was paying close attention to the situation. She had quietly made her way to the outskirts of the gathering crowd, watching George's interaction with the constables from a distance. She didn't need to be near him to understand what was happening. His body language, his speech, the way he fidgeted with his coat cuffs. It all spoke volumes to her. She observed that George was not as calm as he wanted to appear. His eyes, though steady, held a certain depth of guilt that was difficult to hide. There was something far more complicated in his demeanour than a simple case of concern for a missing brother. Miss Marple had seen it all before, a guilty man trying too hard to look innocent. As George was escorted to the constable's cart to be taken for further questioning, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the rest of the village. The whispers had begun anew, and this time the focus had shifted. The villagers were all too eager to latch onto the idea that George might have been involved, conveniently ignoring any deeper complications. Yet Miss Marple wasn't so easily fooled. She knew that there was far more at play here. George may have been a suspect, but he was only one part of the larger puzzle. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the estate, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Collins, the widow of the deceased. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mrs. Collins was seated by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, looking as though she had been waiting for Miss Marple's visit all along. "Miss Marple," she said softly, her eyes meeting the older woman's with a weary, almost resigned look. "I'm sure the police have questioned you as well. I don't have much to say, but I fear you'll find no answers here." Miss Marple seated herself opposite Mrs. Collins, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "Sometimes the best answers come from unexpected places," she said gently, though her words were laced with more meaning than she let on. Mrs. Collins glanced down at her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress nervously. "You know how it is," she replied. "The truth is I've spent years trying to understand Henry. He was a complicated man, always so guarded, so distant. We were never close, really, even after all these years of marriage. His obsession with his family estate, with keeping everything in order, it pushed us apart." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind raced. There was more to this than Mrs. Collins was saying. Did you and your husband ever discuss his brother, George? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. Mrs. Collins' eyes flickered. Yes, of course. Henry and George. They were always at odds. Henry was the responsible one, you see, always looking after the business, while George— She trailed off, looking out the window as though searching for the right words. George was always a bit of a disappointment. He never had any real ambition, you know. But Henry tried so hard to make him into something he wasn't. It was a strain on all of us. The tension between the brothers was palpable in Mrs. Collins' voice. The rift, the unspoken animosity. It was clear that George's return had stirred old feelings. It was easy to imagine the resentment that might have built over the years, leading to something more dangerous. And what about the day of Henry's death? Miss Marple asked, her gaze unwavering. Did he mention anything to you? Any concerns or plans? Mrs. Collins was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant. No, she finally said, her voice low. He didn't say anything about his brother coming by. In fact, he was acting strangely that morning, distracted, almost as though he was avoiding something. But he never spoke of it directly. Miss Marple studied her carefully, reading her expressions. The subtle shifts in Mrs. Collins' demeanour didn't go unnoticed. It was as if she was carefully choosing her words, reluctant to reveal anything that might cast light on the truth. Did Henry ever tell you about any plans for the estate? Miss Marple pressed, her tone soft but insistent. Mrs. Collins hesitated, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle. Finally the woman shook her head. No, nothing. Henry. He was secretive about his affairs. Too secretive. He didn't trust anyone with the business. There it was again, trust or the lack of it. It was becoming clear to Miss Marple that Henry Collins' death was no simple tragedy. There were too many motives, too many loose ends. The rift between the brothers, the secrecy surrounding the estate, and now the growing unease in the village. It was all coming together. But the more she uncovered, the more questions arose. Outside, the last rays of sunlight faded, and the quiet village of Westbridge seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to come to light. Miss Marple knew that they were only at the beginning. The killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight. The investigation into Henry Collins' death had begun to stagnate. The police, having questioned George Collins and Mrs. Collins, had turned their attention to the possibility of a family dispute gone wrong. The suspicion fell squarely on George, the estranged brother, whose return to Westbridge seemed timed with the murder in a way that could not be ignored. But Miss Marple, as always, remained unconvinced by the obvious conclusions. Something was missing. She could feel it in the air, in the way the villagers looked over their shoulders and whispered behind their hands. The truth, she was sure, was still concealed in the smallest of details. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple made her way to the village library, a quiet little building tucked away near the heart of Westbridge. The library, though modest, had always been a refuge for the villagers, a place of knowledge, yes, but also a sanctuary for anyone seeking solitude. And in a village like Westbridge, solitude often bred revelations. As Miss Marple entered, the librarian, Mrs. Parker, looked up with a faint smile. Mrs. Parker was a woman of middle age, soft-spoken, and often seen as the quiet observer of village life. She had worked in the library for years and was, in Miss Marple's mind, an invaluable resource. People who frequented the library often left behind little pieces of information, forgotten letters, misplaced notes, or casual comments dropped in the midst of a conversation. It was the perfect place to look for a clue that others might overlook. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Parker," Miss Marple greeted her, settling into one of the chairs by the window. "I hope you're well today." "Quite well, thank you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Parker replied with a warm smile. "Is there anything I can help you with?" "I was thinking," Miss Marple said slowly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, "that perhaps you might have some records that could shed light on Mr. Collins' activities. You know, the ones who frequent this place. They all leave little traces of themselves in unexpected ways." Mrs. Parker raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about his books, aren't you?" she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And perhaps anything else. Any letters, old accounts, things that might have been overlooked. Sometimes it's not the obvious records, but the things that aren't filed neatly in the catalogue that make all the difference." Mrs. Parker hesitated, then nodded. "Well, I suppose we could look through some of his old records. He was in here quite a lot. especially when he was trying to sort through his family's papers. But I'll warn you, Miss Marple, Henry Collins was a private man, to put it mildly. He didn't leave many personal things lying around. That's just it, Miss Marple said, her voice almost a whisper. It's what's left behind that tells the story. The two women made their way to the back of the library, where a small alcove contained the local history section. Mrs. Parker led Miss Marple to a worn wooden cabinet, and after a moment of fumbling with the key, opened it to reveal a collection of old books and ledgers. Most of the records were innocuous: community donations, historical accounts of the village, and the occasional property dispute. But Miss Marple's eyes were immediately drawn to a small leather-bound book tucked away in the corner of the cabinet. It was a journal, its edges worn from years of use. "Is this it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. Mrs. Parker gave the journal a reluctant glance before nodding. "That's the one. I'd forgotten it was even in here. It belonged to Henry. He would come in from time to time making notes about his estate and the business dealings. I never thought much of it, but now that you mention it, it might be worth looking at." Miss Marple took the journal carefully, as though it might hold some fragile secret. She opened the first page, and after a moment's scanning, she smiled softly. "Do you mind if I take a look at this, Mrs. Parker?" "Of course, Miss Marple," the librarian replied, though her curiosity was evident. "But if you find something unusual, do let me know." Miss Marple nodded and sat down in the chair by the window, flipping through the pages slowly, letting the words sink in. The entries were detailed, describing Henry's thoughts on the family estate, his dealings with local business partners, and occasional notes about his brother, George. Half of the journal entries revealed an obsessive desire for control over the family's wealth, and at first it seemed harmless enough, merely a man's meticulous record-keeping. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a few lines at the back of the journal, written in a hurried hand. "I need to protect everything. George will never understand. I will be careful. If anything happens, the family must be preserved at all costs. I can't trust anyone, especially not George. The will must remain hidden, and no one can know about it. Not yet." Miss Marple's heart quickened. These words, scrawled in haste, were important, more important than anything else in the journal. They hinted at a deeper conflict, one that Henry Collins had been keeping secret. It wasn't just a matter of business rivalry or a family quarrel. It was something far more personal, something worth protecting by any means necessary. Henry's concern about his brother George was clear, but the mention of a hidden will was the clue that Miss Marple had been waiting for. Carefully she closed the journal, her mind racing as she considered the implications of what she'd just read. Henry had been hiding something that could explain the animosity between the brothers, and more importantly, something that might explain why Henry had been murdered. After a moment, she stood up, returning the journal to Mrs. Parker with a few quiet words of thanks. The librarian watched her with interest but said nothing more. Miss Marple's mind was already 1,000 steps ahead. As she walked back toward her cottage, her mind turned over the new information she had gathered. The will, Henry's paranoia, the hidden family secrets. All these things pointed to one undeniable truth: the murder was not a random act. It was the result of a carefully executed plan, one that had been set in motion long before that fateful afternoon by the garden shed. But who had known about the will? Who stood to gain from its concealment? And more importantly, who was desperate enough to kill for it? The clues were beginning to form, and Miss Marple knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would reveal itself. But the game was not yet over. She would need to dig deeper, to ask the right questions, and to see through the carefully constructed facades the villagers had put up. For now, though, one thing was certain. The killer was someone close, someone who knew Henry's secret. The morning after her discovery in the library, Miss Marple sat by her window, the early light casting long shadows across her cottage. Her mind, as always, was a quiet whirl of thoughts. The hidden journal had provided some critical insight into Henry Collins' life, his obsessive need for control, his deep mistrust of his brother George, and the mysterious mention of a concealed will. But even with this new revelation, there was still a sense of something unfinished. The villagers had their suspicions, the constables had their theories, and yet Miss Marple knew the truth was more elusive. Westbridge had always been a village where secrets were as common as the hedgerows lining the country lanes. Everyone had their little betrayals, their hidden agendas, They're half-finished stories. In such a place, the truth often had to be dragged out, layer by delicate layer. But who, Miss Marple wondered, was willing to go to such lengths as murder to protect those layers? She wasn't the only one thinking this. As the day wore on, the tension in the village grew palpable. Everyone seemed to be watching everyone else. The air felt thick, as though something was about to break, and the ever-watchful Miss Marple could sense the small fractures in the facade of the village's calm. It was late afternoon when the knock came at the door, sharp and insistent. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt as she made her way to answer it. To her surprise, it was Mrs. Collins, her face pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Miss Marple, I need your help," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. I've been thinking about what you said, about the will. I need to tell you something more, something I should have told you before." Miss Marple led her inside, offering tea and a seat by the fire, though she had the feeling that Mrs. Collins was beyond the comfort of any ordinary hospitality. The woman was clearly troubled, and Miss Marple could see the conflict within her. Something had changed since their last conversation, something deep and unsettling. Mrs. Collins, though still grieving, was no longer the same woman who had been so guarded and evasive before. "I'm listening, Mrs. Collins," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft yet steady. Mrs. Collins hesitated, looking down at her hands before meeting Miss Marple's gaze. "I've been hiding something I should have confessed long ago. Henry had his secrets, yes, but so did I." She paused, swallowing hard. "There's more to the will than you think. More than anyone knows." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest, though she maintained her calm demeanour. "Go on," she said, her tone never wavering. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath before continuing. "Henry was never a good husband, you see. He was controlling. He treated me like a child, as if I couldn't make decisions for myself. But there was one thing that kept him from pushing me too far, his fear of losing the estate. He made me sign things I didn't understand, legal papers, documents, things that kept me tied to him, to everything he had built, the estate, the business, everything." Miss Marple sat forward slightly, her fingers clasped together as she processed the information. This was something new, something important. "And what about the will?" she asked. Mrs. Collins' eyes darkened, a shadow of guilt passing over her features. "Henry changed it. About a year ago, he made a new will. He told me it was to protect the estate, that it was his last chance to ensure the family legacy continued. But I think it was more than that. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. And it wasn't just me who was affected. George, his brother, he was always the one who would inherit it all, Henry said. He was the next in line, the one who would carry the family name. But Henry had plans for that will. He changed it, removed George's name from it completely." Miss Marple's mind raced as she absorbed this information. "So, the will Henry changed, was it kept secret from George?" "Yes," Mrs. Collins said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Henry didn't want George to know. He thought George would try to take control of the estate if he found out. He didn't trust him, and I didn't trust Henry enough to ask too many questions. I was afraid of what would happen if I did." "Did George know about this new will?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Collins shook her head, her expression a mix of fear and regret. "No, at least I don't think he did. But Henry, he was always so careful, so methodical. He kept everything locked away. I never saw it, but I know it was there. He would talk about it sometimes, how he had finally secured the estate from George's influence. He was proud of it. He thought it was his way of winning." Miss Marple stood up slowly, her mind working at full speed. This new information was crucial. Henry Collins had not simply been a man with an estate to protect. He had been a man obsessed with keeping control, even from beyond the grave. And this new will, hidden away, unknown to the very people who should have been entitled to it, was the key to the entire mystery. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze steady on Mrs. Collins. "And you didn't think to tell anyone about this sooner?" "I didn't know who to trust," Mrs. Collins replied, her voice breaking. "Not even Henry, not after everything. I couldn't." A knock on the door interrupted her. Miss Marple glanced toward it, her instincts telling her this was no ordinary visitor. She moved to the door and opened it to reveal none other than George Collins, his face a mixture of anxiety and determination. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "I need to speak with you. It's about Henry." "I think you know what I'm talking about." George's words hung in the air for a moment before Miss Marple spoke. "Come in, Mr. Collins," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "It seems we have much to discuss." George glanced at Mrs. Collins before taking a seat, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple. "I know you've been talking to people about the will, and I know what Henry did. I never thought he'd do something like this. He's my brother, my flesh and blood, but I've never felt so shut out of everything. I think he was planning to cut me off completely. He was hiding things from me. You have to believe me." "Mr. Collins," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but sharp, "I don't believe anyone is entirely innocent in this situation, but I do believe there are many layers to this mystery. And if we are to get to the bottom of it, we must be honest with one another." George nodded, his expression hardening. "I will tell you everything, Miss Marple, but I have one thing to say before we go any further. Henry didn't just die by accident. Someone wanted him dead, and I have a feeling that someone is still out there, hiding in plain sight." Miss Marple met his gaze, her mind already working through the implications. The pieces were falling into place, but not yet completely. It was still a puzzle, and the real killer had yet to reveal themselves. "Then," Miss Marple said, "let's find the answers together. But be warned, Mr. Collins, truths once uncovered can't be buried again." The village of Westbridge had become a place of whispered conversations and fleeting glances. The murder of Henry Collins had shattered the calm, but it also unearthed deep-seated fears that had long been buried beneath the surface. As Miss Marple stood in her modest sitting room, reflecting on the events of the past days, one thing was clear. There were still too many unanswered questions. Every time she thought she had a lead, it would slip from her fingers only to reveal yet another layer of complexity. The Collins family saga was tangled with deceit, ambition, and secrets. The hidden will, the strained relationship between Henry and his brother George, and the odd behaviour of Mrs. Collins all pointed toward motives that could drive someone to murder. But even as the police turned their attention to George, Miss Marple's instincts told her that the obvious answer was rarely the correct one. That evening, just as Miss Marple was preparing to take a quiet walk around the village, a sudden knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find a pale-faced Constable Hughes, looking unusually dishevelled. His uniform was unkempt, and there was an air of urgency about him. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and hurried, "you need to come with me. There's been another incident." Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she took in the constable's distressed state. "What has happened?" "It's Mrs. Pemberton," Hughes said quickly, looking over his shoulder as though to ensure no one was listening. "She's been found, and it doesn't look good." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Mrs. Pemberton had always been an enigma, a woman whose reserved manner had made her difficult to read. She had been present at the garden party the day Henry's body had been discovered, and though she had tried to maintain her composure, and Miss Marple had sensed a deeper discomfort in her. Now the constable's words confirmed her worst fears. "Take me to her," Miss Marple said calmly, her mind already racing through the possibilities. The village was full of secrets, but now, it seemed, there was more to uncover, secrets that had yet to be revealed. Constable Hughes led the way through the winding streets of Westbridge. As they neared Mrs. Pemberton's home, a small cottage on the edge of the village, the tension in the air thickened. The faint smell of damp earth lingered in the cool evening breeze, and the once peaceful surroundings seemed ominously quiet. Mrs. Pemberton's house, like many in Westbridge, was tucked behind a small garden. The windows were shuttered, and the front door stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple entered first, followed closely by the constable, who seemed ill at ease in the quiet surroundings. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the air heavy with a musty scent. The living room was sparsely furnished, with only a few chairs and a table near the fireplace. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the scene in the far corner of the room. Mrs. Pemberton lay motionless on the floor, her body twisted unnaturally. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just the stillness of death, as though she had collapsed from some unseen force. Her face, pale and drawn, bore the expression of someone who had seen something terrifying, something that had left her unable to defend herself. Miss Marple approached the body carefully, her sharp eyes scanning the room for any signs of disturbance. The constable had already called for a doctor, but Miss Marple knew that it was unlikely to help now. The cause of death was already evident to her, though no one would admit it just yet. "She's been poisoned," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm and steady. Constable Hughes, his face pale, looked at her in disbelief. "How can you be so sure, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple crouched beside the body, her gaze flicking to the small table by the fire. A teacup sat there, its rim darkened with a stain. The same faint discoloration Miss Marple had seen at Henry Collins' estate. She noted the same sickly greenish hue in the woman's lips, the subtle signs of poisoning that only someone as observant as Miss Marple could recognise. "See the discoloration on her lips," Miss Marple pointed out, "and the slight tremor in her fingers. This is the same sign of arsenic poisoning that I saw at Henry's body. It's a subtle thing. But it's there." The constable stepped back, his face blanching further. But why Mrs. Pemberton? What could she have known? Miss Marple stood slowly, her mind whirring as she pieced together the implications. Mrs. Pemberton may have known more than she let on. You said she was with Lady Harrow at the garden party the day of Henry's death. Perhaps she overheard something she shouldn't have, or maybe she knew about the will and its contents. It's too early to say, but one thing is clear. Mrs. Pemberton's death isn't an accident. She was murdered to silence her. As the constable stepped outside to summon more help, Miss Marple lingered in the room, her eyes scanning the small details. The book on the side table, the half-written letter on the desk, the teacup now staining the floor, each item seemed to carry a story of its own, waiting to be uncovered. By the time Miss Marple left the house, her mind was made up. The events of the last few days, the secrets of the Collins family, the hidden will, and now the poisoning of Mrs. Pemberton, all of it pointed to something far darker than a simple family dispute. This wasn't just about money or inheritance, it was about control, and someone was willing to kill to maintain it. As she walked back toward her cottage, Miss Marple's mind began to connect the dots. The more she thought about it, the more she realised that the killer had been right under her nose the entire time. But she wasn't ready to expose them just yet. There was still more to uncover, and every piece of the puzzle had to fit perfectly before the truth could be revealed. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, the warm liquid offering her a moment of peace before the storm. She knew that this was only the beginning. The web of lies was growing tighter, and with it the danger was becoming more palpable. But Miss Marple had always trusted her instincts, and her instincts told her that the killer would make a mistake, a slip-up, an oversight, that would reveal everything. And when that moment came, Miss Marple would be ready. The village of Westbridge had become a place of quiet suspicion, its streets now shadowed by the recent events. Henry Collins' murder, followed by Mrs. Pemberton's poisoning, had left the villagers on edge. Fear was growing, and with it the whispers. It was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about finding the person who would do anything to keep it hidden. Miss Marple had spent the last few days quietly watching, listening and waiting. The clues had begun to fall into place, but there was still one final piece of the puzzle missing. She knew that whoever had killed Henry and Mrs. Pemberton was skilled at manipulation, carefully crafting a web of lies and deceit to mislead everyone. But even the most careful manipulator left small traces behind, traces that Miss Marple was now poised to follow. It was early evening when Miss Marple invited George Collins to her cottage. He had become increasingly agitated since his earlier visit, the tension in his face growing as the days wore on. Miss Marple knew he was hiding something, but she also knew that to confront him directly would be to push him further into his shell. Instead, she would use his own anxiety against him, just as the killer had used their own. When George entered the cottage, Miss Marple was seated by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up at him with a calm, unflinching gaze. George seemed more on edge than ever, his posture stiff and his hands clenched at his sides. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "I've been thinking about everything you've said, about the will, about Henry, about everything that's happened. I need to know what you think. I don't want to be part of this anymore. I just want the truth to come out." Miss Marple studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "The truth," she said softly, "is something that can't be forced, Mr. Collins. It has to be uncovered piece by piece. You must understand that." "But you have one advantage that the rest of us don't." "And what's that?" George asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "You know the truth," Miss Marple replied, her voice low and steady, "but you're afraid to admit it. That's why you've been so defensive, so quick to distance yourself from everything. You're scared, Mr. Collins, scared of the consequences of the truth, but fear doesn't change what happened." George shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. "I didn't kill Henry," he said quickly, his voice rising. "I swear I didn't. You have to believe me." Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the rapid rise in his voice, the nervous tick in his eye. "You're telling me you didn't do it, but you're not telling me who did," she said gently. "You're avoiding the question, Mr. Collins. And I believe that's because you know the answer." George's eyes widened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might say something, but instead he clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. "You're not the only one with secrets, Mr. Collins," Miss Marple continued, her tone now a little sharper. "The people in this village, your brother, Mrs. Pemberton, they all kept their own secrets too. And when secrets are kept for too long, they have a way of coming to the surface, don't they?" George shifted again, his nervous energy palpable. He opened his mouth to speak, but Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. "You see, Mr. Collins," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I know what you're trying to hide. You knew about the will. You knew Henry had changed it. And you knew he didn't trust you. That is what started this chain of events. But it's not just about a will, is it? It's about control and power. It's about proving that you are the one who can take over the estate, that you're the one who deserves it." George's eyes flickered, his breath quickening as he stared at Miss Marple. She had hit the mark. The fear was now obvious in his eyes, fear that he had been caught, fear that he couldn't hide the truth any longer. "You've been trying to cover your tracks, haven't you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice never rising above a calm whisper. "You thought that by distancing yourself from your brother's death, you could avoid suspicion. But you were wrong, Mr. Collins. You were wrong to think you could hide your involvement, and now you're trapped in your own web of lies." At that moment, Miss Marple saw a shift in George's demeanour. His shoulders slumped and his hands loosened their grip. The defiance that had been present in his eyes moments before melted away, replaced by something more vulnerable, something Miss Marple recognised as guilt. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," George said, his voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to secure my future. I thought, if I could just get Henry to see that I was capable, that I could handle the estate, that he might leave it to me. But he wouldn't listen. He kept pushing me away. I never meant for him to die." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained firm. "You see, Mr. Collins," she said gently, "this is why the truth is always the best option. Because when you hide from it, when you try to force it into something else, it becomes a poison that spreads until it destroys everything around you. You could have worked together, but you didn't, and now here we are." George stood there in silence, his gaze fixed on the floor as he processed the weight of his words. Miss Marple waited, allowing the silence to stretch just a little longer before continuing. "Now," she said, her voice calm once more, "you've confessed the most important part. The rest of it will come in time, and when it does, it will make sense to all of us. But you must understand, Mr. Collins, that there are still others involved, people who have their own part to play in this tragedy." George's head snapped up, his eyes filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "The web is much larger than you think, Mr. Collins, and I believe I know who else is involved. But first we must watch and we must wait. The trap has been set, and now the real killer will reveal themselves." With that, Miss Marple stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She turned toward the door, then paused before glancing back at George. "You may not have been the one to kill your brother, but you've played a part in something much darker than you understand. And now we must let the truth come to the surface." As George stood there, staring at her in silence, Miss Marple left the room, her mind already turning to the next step in the investigation. She knew that the end was near, but there was still one final piece of the puzzle to uncover. The trap was set and the killer was about to make their move. The days following her conversation with George Collins were fraught with a quiet tension. Miss Marple had observed, listened, and waited, watching as the villagers continued to go about their daily lives, none the wiser to the unravelling mystery that lay just beneath the surface. Everyone, from the high-ranking Lady Harrow to the lowly servants who worked at the estate, seemed to have a hand in the story, each contributing their own carefully crafted facade, each guarding their own secrets. But Miss Marple knew that every mask could be peeled away with enough patience, enough observation. It had all come down to this moment, the final act. The truth she knew would soon be exposed, and the people responsible would finally be revealed. But before she could piece everything together, she needed one final confirmation. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple made her way to Lady Harrow's estate once more. The air had grown cooler, and the distant hum of village life seemed quieter than usual. The last few days had been full of moving pieces, shifting motivations, subtle admissions and false pretences. But as Miss Marple walked through the wrought-iron gates, she felt a peculiar sense of finality in the air. Inside, the drawing-room was just as she remembered, stately and immaculate, with sunlight filtering through the windows casting shadows on the polished floors. Lady Harrow, ever the gracious host, sat with a slight smile, though her eyes betrayed the unease that had been building since Henry Collins' death. "Miss Marple," Lady Harrow greeted her with a small nod, her voice still steady, though tinged with apprehension. "I trust you found what you've been looking for?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair opposite Lady Harrow, "though there is still one last matter we must discuss." The two women exchanged a brief, knowing look, and Miss Marple began, as she often did, with a few subtle observations. "It's always in the quiet moments, you know," she said softly, her eyes flicking to the window, "that people forget they are being watched. The smallest gestures can betray the deepest of secrets." Lady Harrow's hand, resting on her lap, twitched slightly, but she said nothing. Miss Marple noted the reaction, small but significant. She had her attention now. "You were at the garden party the day Henry died," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. "You saw Mrs. Pemberton, I'm sure, and you must have overheard something that made you uneasy, perhaps something that Mrs. Pemberton knew but didn't dare speak of." Lady Harrow's lips tightened, but she remained silent. It was the first sign of real emotion Miss Marple had seen from her. The woman was no longer the composed, aloof figure she had once been. Now there was an almost imperceptible fear in her eyes. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "You were worried, weren't you? Worried that Mrs. Pemberton had learned the truth about Henry's will." Lady Harrow's breath caught, and for the first time the mask cracked. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she whispered, almost inaudibly. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I thought if I could just keep control of the estate, I could keep it all together, for my family." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "So it was you," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "You were the one who made sure Henry's will was never found. You were the one who knew about the changes, and you were the one who couldn't let go of your hold on the estate." Lady Harrow's eyes flickered to the door as though she might flee, but instead she sat frozen, her hand trembling slightly. Her face was pale, the mask of composure utterly gone. "I never wanted this," Lady Harrow murmured, almost to herself. "I never wanted any of this. But Henry was difficult. He had his own plans for the estate, his own ideas about how things should be, and when George returned, it was like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, was slipping away. I couldn't let that happen." Miss Marple listened in silence, letting the woman's confession hang in the air. "So, you did what you thought you had to do," she said slowly. "You acted out of fear. Fear that if Henry and George reconciled, if they worked together, you would lose everything. So you took matters into your own hands." Lady Harrow nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, I had to. Henry was so focused on his brother, on keeping George in the dark about the changes to the will, that he never noticed how much I controlled. He trusted me. Too much. I thought if I could just keep George away from it all, if I could just keep the will hidden, I would have the power I needed, but I couldn't control everything." There was a long pause before Miss Marple spoke again. "But what about Mrs. Pemberton?" she asked. "She knew about the will, didn't she? And she was going to tell someone, wasn't she?" Lady Harrow's eyes filled with regret, but also something darker, something far more dangerous. "Mrs. Pemberton was a complication. She was loyal to me, but she also had her own ideas. I thought I could keep her quiet, but when she started asking too many questions, I knew she had to be silenced. She wasn't supposed to know. She wasn't supposed to understand the importance of that will." A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. Lady Harrow had crossed a line, but the revelation was almost too perfect. All the pieces were falling into place now, and the truth was finally becoming clear. "So you killed her," Miss Marple said quietly. "You poisoned her to keep her quiet. You saw her as a threat, just as you saw your brother and Henry's relationship as a threat. And now it's all unravelling." Lady Harrow's face hardened, and for a brief moment the calm facade returned. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her voice cold. "But there's nothing more to say now. The game is up." Miss Marple stood, her gaze unwavering as she addressed Lady Harrow. "It's never too late to face the truth, Lady Harrow," she said softly. "You may have thought you were in control, but in the end it was your fear that drove you to commit the very thing you sought to avoid." Lady Harrow said nothing, but her eyes, once so composed, were now filled with a resigned acceptance. The constables arrived soon after, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier call. The truth, as she knew it would, had surfaced at last. The will, the motive, the fear, all had led to this moment. As the constables took Lady Harrow away, Miss Marple stood alone in the room, her thoughts drifting back to the villagers who would now have to come to terms with the darkness that had been hiding beneath their perfect little world. She had done her part, uncovered the truth, and watched as justice began to take shape. But even in the quiet aftermath, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy. People, after all, were flawed. They carried their secrets with them, hidden from the world until they could hide them no longer. And while the truth had been exposed, Miss Marple knew that the scars would linger long after the final page of this mystery was turned. As she stepped outside, the village seemed quieter than ever. But there was a certain peace now, one that came from knowing that, for all the shadows of human nature, the light of truth would always find its way through. The morning after Lady Harrow's arrest, the village of Westbridge seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The quiet that had once been filled with whispers of uncertainty now held a new, almost mournful stillness. Miss Marple had seen it all before, the unravelling of a seemingly perfect world, the facade crumbling under the weight of its own lies, and though justice had been served, the toll it had taken on the villagers was still palpable. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, her thoughts running over the events of the past weeks. The murder of Henry Collins, the poisoning of Mrs. Pemberton, and the tangled web of secrets that had ensnared so many, all of it had led to one undeniable truth. Lady Harrow, in her desperate bid to maintain control, had allowed fear and power to cloud her judgment, ultimately leading her to murder. But there was more to it than just Lady Harrow's actions. There were the repercussions, the quiet victims of the lies she had woven, and the ripple effect that would continue to affect Westbridge long after the case had been closed. As Miss Marple sat in thought, there came a gentle knock at the door. She rose to answer it, expecting the constable or perhaps one of the villagers seeking her counsel. But when she opened the door, she was greeted not by an official but by George Collins. "Miss Marple," he said softly, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his posture slumped as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. "I know you must be tired of seeing me, but I couldn't leave without speaking with you. I owe you an explanation." Miss Marple gestured for him to enter, and he stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed smaller now than when she had last seen him, defeated, stripped of the bravado he had once worn like armour. "I've been thinking," George said, his voice low, "about everything that's happened, about Henry, and about my role in it all. I can't help but wonder how much of this could have been avoided, how much I could have done differently." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, settling into her chair as she regarded him quietly. "Go on," she said. "You've come to a conclusion, I think." "I've spent my life believing that I was owed something," George confessed, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was entitled to the estate, to my place in the family, to the recognition that Henry always received. But I see now how wrong I was. Henry, he had his faults, yes, but he was right about one thing. Everything was about control. We were all pawns in his game, and I was just too blinded by my own desires to see it." Miss Marple studied him carefully, her eyes softening as she observed the deep remorse that seemed to have settled in his demeanour. "Sometimes, Mr. Collins, we're all blind to the truths that are staring us in the face," she said. "It is the nature of human nature to desire more than what we have, to covet what is out of our reach. But there comes a point when that desire becomes dangerous, when it clouds our judgment and makes us forget what truly matters." George nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I never thought Henry's death would come to this. I never imagined that my desire for control would lead to such devastation. I didn't kill him. I didn't kill Mrs. Pemberton, but in my own way I feel just as responsible. I ignored the signs. I let my greed, my anger, blind me to the truth. And now look at the mess it's all caused. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. You are not solely to blame, Mr. Collins. No, there were many pieces to this puzzle, and you were only one of them. But you were the catalyst. Your return to the village, your desire to claim what you felt was rightfully yours, set everything in motion. You cannot change the past, but you can choose what you do with the future. George looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time since he had entered the room. I wish I could go back, he said, his voice breaking. I wish I could have made different choices, but what's done is done. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. There are few things in this world more damaging than regret, Mr. Collins. But there is also something very freeing in accepting responsibility for what we have done. It is a step toward healing, if not for you, then for the people around you. For a moment, George was silent, his eyes distant. Then, finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of his words had settled in his chest. I don't know what will happen to me now, he said, but I know that I can't continue to live in the shadows of my brother's mistakes. I'll have to find my own way forward. I'll have to make amends, not just for what happened with Henry, yes, but for what I failed to see all these years. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet understanding. It is not the past that defines us, Mr. Collins. It is what we do with the present that matters most. George stood, his shoulders a little less burdened than before. Thank you, Miss Marple, he said quietly. You've given me something I didn't expect, clarity. I'll never be able to undo what's been done, but I can try to do better. As George left, Miss Marple stood by the door, watching him disappear into the distance. She knew that his journey toward redemption, however long, had begun. And perhaps, in time, Westbridge could begin its own healing as well. With a soft sigh, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her thoughts returning to the mystery that had so thoroughly consumed her. The puzzle was complete, the truth laid bare. Lady Harrow's motives had been revealed. Her desperation to control everything in her life, her desire to keep the estate at all costs, even if it meant murder. And Mrs. Pemberton had been the unfortunate casualty, caught in the web of deceit spun by Lady Harrow, who had believed that the only way to protect herself was through silence and death. But even as the case drew to a close, Miss Marple knew that human nature was unchanging. There would always be another secret to uncover, another lie to unravel. But for now, the village of Westbridge would be left to reflect on the consequences of its actions, and Miss Marple could finally rest. The truth had been revealed, and justice, in its quiet way, had been served. The sun had begun to set over Westbridge, casting long shadows across the small village. The air was cool, crisp with the beginning of autumn, and the streets, once filled with the hum of anxious whispers and hurried footsteps, now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The arrest of Lady Harrow, the quiet exposure of her twisted motives, and the unravelling of the murder mystery had done something to the village, something that wasn't immediately apparent but lingered in the very air itself. Miss Marple sat in her small cottage, a cup of tea in her hands, gazing out of the window as she reflected on the past weeks. The puzzle had been completed. The pieces of the mystery, Henry Collins' death, Mrs. Pemberton's poisoning, the hidden will, the lies spun by Lady Harrow, had all come together with the quiet precision of a clock winding down. The truth, as always, had been brought to light, but the consequences were far-reaching. Yet even in a village as quiet as Westbridge, secrets had a way of seeping through the cracks, and once exposed they left their mark on everything. Lady Harrow, now in custody, had confessed to the murders, though she was still cold in her admission. She had acted out of a mixture of fear, control, and a deep entrenched belief that the family estate, and her role as its keeper, was the most important thing in her life. Miss Marple had seen it before. A person's fixation on their own version of order, their need to control everything, even to the point of death. It had destroyed Lady Harrow, as it so often destroyed those who couldn't let go of their illusions of power. But while justice had been served, Miss Marple knew that Westbridge was not the same village it had been before. The web of lies had cut deep, and the relationships between many of its residents were irrevocably changed. It was hard to say if the village could ever truly return to the innocent quiet it had once known, or if it would forever be stained by the truth they had uncovered. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Miss Marple set her teacup aside before rising slowly. She was not surprised to see George Collins standing in the doorway. He looked different now, not the defiant man who'd first come to her seeking answers, but someone who had been humbled, someone who had found a measure of peace in the aftermath of the storm. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been when they last spoke. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for helping me see the truth, for helping me understand where I went wrong." Miss Marple nodded, motioning for him to sit. "I've said it before, Mr. Collins," she said gently. "It is not the past that defines us, but what we do with the present. You have taken the first step toward making amends, and that is something, in the end, that no one can take from you." George sat down, his posture more relaxed than before. His face, though still lined with the weight of recent events, seemed less burdened now. "I don't know what will happen to me next," he said, looking out the window as though he were trying to see his future clearly for the first time. "I know I've got a lot of work to do to repair the damage I've caused, but I also know that things can't stay the way they were. I can't go back to being the man I was. I can't keep pretending that it was everyone else who was at fault." "That is a good start," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, but there was a softness in it now that had not been there before. "You see, Mr. Collins, the hardest part of life is accepting our own flaws, but once we do, once we allow ourselves the grace of growth, we begin to see the world differently." George smiled faintly. "I think I understand now. It's not about proving myself to anyone else. It's about proving something to myself, that I'm capable of being better." Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. And it is that journey, the one of understanding and self-reflection, that will lead you forward." There was a long pause before George spoke again. "I'm sorry for what happened to Henry. I'm sorry for what happened to Mrs. Pemberton too. I never meant for any of this to happen. You were caught in the web of the same desires that have ensnared others," Miss Marple said quietly. "Greed, pride, and the desire for control. They cloud our judgment, and they make us forget that the most important things in life are the ones that can't be controlled." George looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting nervously. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do now," he said quietly. "The estate. I never really wanted it, not like Henry did. But now it feels like the only thing left, the only thing I have left." Miss Marple considered this, her eyes thoughtful. "The estate, Mr. Collins, is just a place, a house, a piece of land. What matters is what you do with your life now. You can choose to make something of it, to make amends for your mistakes. But the land, the estate, it will not define you. It is your actions, your integrity that will." For a moment George sat in silence, considering her words. Then, with a deep breath, he stood up, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's with newfound clarity. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. "I think I understand what I need to do." Miss Marple gave him a small, approving smile. "I believe you do, Mr. Collins." As George left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The case was over, and justice had been served. But more importantly, the people involved, George, Lady Harrow, Mrs. Pemberton, would never be the same. Their lives had been irrevocably altered by the truth that had come to light, and in some ways, Westbridge itself would never be the same either. The quiet village that had once been a haven of peace and civility was now a place where secrets were exposed, where the weight of past mistakes could no longer be ignored. But perhaps, Miss Marple thought, that was not such a bad thing. In truth, the light of revelation, no matter how painful, had a way of clearing the air, allowing new growth to take root. As Miss Marple sat back in her chair, watching the last of the sun's rays fade into the horizon, she knew that there would always be more mysteries to solve, more truths to uncover. But for now she could rest easy, knowing that the truth had been brought to light, and that, in the end, justice had been served.